Hi, everyone. Maureen Greeley here. I am your host for the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling's newest live streaming program, Kaleidoscope. This is the beginning of a long conversation where we'll explore diverse views on mental health, equity, and social justice. That topic could fill hours, weeks, and even years of discussion. So this program is not comprehensive or complete, but we will encourage dialogue and audience participation with respect and the goal of understanding as well as exploring ways to move forward in collaboration and support. It's May, and May is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, so we're thrilled to welcome our first guests, Dr. Victoria Chau from SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, Office of Behavioral Equity, Dr. Tam Dinh, Program Director of Social Work at St. Martin's University and Washington Commissioner on Asian Pacific American Affairs, and Dr. Timothy Fong, Director of the UCLA Addiction Psychiatry Fellowship and co-director of the UCLA Gambling Studies Program. Welcome, everybody. How are you?
Very good. Thank you.
Great.
So excited to have you here. Let's start by acknowledging and respecting the incredible diversity among Asian cultures. Today, just in the United States alone, there are more than 22 million people of Asian descent. And Asians are projected to be the largest immigrant group in our nation by 2055. Still, the term Asian is vague and doesn't begin to express the rich ethnicities and languages and geographic diversities and traditions of some of the world's oldest civilizations. So my first question, and I'm going to ask you to start us off, Victoria, is how do we begin to express this great diversity among Asian cultures, including Asian Pacific Islanders, because there really is no one Asian culture?
Thanks, Maureen. This is a interesting question. I think oftentimes when people hear Asian American or Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, Asian American Pacific Islander, any of the terms that are used to describe the individuals that identify in this group, people have an image that pops up in their head, and it probably relates to certain pieces of different cultures that belong to Asian American Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, but it's not, as you said, one size that will cover everyone. And so for me, when I think about this race group of Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, I like to emphasize to others to really remember that we know that there's so much diversity across the group. So across those who identify as Asian Americans, those who identify as Native Hawaiians, and those who identify as Pacific Islanders. You can look at that by the specific ethnic groups, but there's also a lot of diversity within each ethnic group itself, so there's so many different identities that each individual has that intersect with each other. And so it's really difficult to sort of just lump all of these ethnic groups into one race category of Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander and expect, I think, for us to be able to meet the needs of this group.
Tam or Tim, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would like to add on a little bit to what was said earlier. And you're totally right that we are, Victoria mentioned that there are differences between groups and within groups. And just for example, some of the differences within groups, let's say, for example, the Vietnamese community, right? The differences is really tied to a lot of different factors in when they migrated to America, whether they came in around the 1970s, whether they were one of the boat people in the 1980s, or they came here through sponsored in the 1990s and the 2000s. And so then based on that, people came to America with already different resources and skills, like how much socioeconomic they had in their homeland or education. And then that really impacts their ability to acculturate, All right. And so all of that really leads to a lot of diversity within groups as well. And as part of a lot of the work that we do with CAPA, the Commission on Asian Pacific Affairs, is really advocating for agencies and departments to disaggregate this data, because currently we tend to just lump, like Victoria says, everybody into API as a group. But then we advocate like almost every single, like daily still, on how to disaggregate data. So we really understand the needs and the nuances of the experience of different communities.
Yeah, I'll add a few thoughts. The first is, of course, how do we even get to this point where they all were lumped into one category of Asian? And for me, growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, as a second generation now Chinese American, I didn't have many classmates that were Asian. And then I went to college, it was suddenly 30%. That's when I started learning about the cultures of Filipino, Japanese, Vietnamese, and they were all totally different. And I think just the fact that it was all lumped in highlights how some of the discrimination or some of the racism policies over the last 200 years fell into that. But now we're reversing that. So to me, how do we express that great diversity? Is by learning history. And one of the really amazing things over the last 2 years, I'm starting to see more documentaries out there about the Asian American experience. Particularly PBS has some of these. We're starting to see more shows. We're starting to see more people talk about that. And I picked up some of my old history books, and I realized there aren't any chapters in there about internment or about the railroads or about Boxer rebellions and things like that. So I think the most important thing to recognize there is we have to be very curious about learning these cultures. And that has to stem from everything that we do as mental health professionals, as educators, as community advocates. We have to go back and realize that the Filipino experience is so different than the Vietnamese experience, which is so different than the Chinese American experience. And then even just the language, I identify as Asian American. And my parents identified themselves as Chinese. And I thought that was very powerful. And I said, well, aren't we all the same? And they say, no, you are predominantly Chinese American, which is a different experience than being just American. So just a few general thoughts to think about.
I think that's really telling. And I think that when you bring in the current documentaries versus the way we've seen Asian culture depicted in books and movies and fiction, are they depicting the correct pictures? And are we getting a real sense of social norms, particularly as that relates to self-care and mental health? Are there any specific taboos or stigma or mental health issues that we need to be addressing or helping Asian Americans address so that they can freely seek mental health care? I don't know who might like to start that topic.
I'll start. I can start. I would just say for this, one thing to keep in mind is specifically Asian American culture. A lot of these cultures are very different than Western cultures. So the idea of mental health in itself may be very different across these different ethnic groups. And so when we're talking about mental health in terms of helping Asian Americans receive treatment, for instance, we have to really take a step back and understand, how do they even perceive mental health? Is mental health even a word in their language? What does that equate to them? What Westerners may view as mental health? What is that in that specific culture? And then how do we work with that community to help them meet their needs by honoring whatever traditions that they may have that are not harmful to their mental health, but then also finding a way to engage that community into mental health treatment if that's needed.
So, Maureen, when you mentioned about how all the cultures were lumped together, it made me think about, I don't know if you guys all seen that new Disney movie, Raya. I loved it. It was awesome. And I love seeing reflection of my identity. But then similar, like the critiques of Moana, where a lot of the Polynesians, or in this movie in particular, a lot of the Asian cultures were just kind of lumped together. And then it became out, you're like, is that Thailand? Is that Vietnam? Is that, and so it's kind of going back to how do we have to tease apart, because like Victoria says, conceptualization of mental health, it's so different by different cultures. And so when we lump them together, we're just starting from the wrong space. And I also think when you talk about self-care, currently what we know in America is a very individual kind of concept, right? I'm going to take time out for myself. And it goes against a lot of what is for those who come from more community based cultures. And so the concept of self-care just being individualistic is actually very selfish to a lot of folks. And so I think we just need to start to think more about what is self-care as it fitting in with what is comfortable to the individual. And so instead of being individualistic, it could be more of a community-based self-care approach. But I don't think we have had those kind of conversation, because still we're trying to fit, this large Asian concept with and try to make it fit in our still very Western perspective and approach to doing things.
That's really interesting. I in 2000, when I was still a resident, I started moonlighting at a place called the Asian Pacific Counseling and Treatment Center. I was out here in Los Angeles, and it was my first experience working in a culturally mental health relevant setting. And I'm like, I'm just going to apply everything I learned from med school and residency and give them Prozac, give them this, and do all that. And it just didn't work. And it was really stunning for me to realize there was such a critical compartment of culture and mental health. The things I picked up were the following. Of course, there's shame. We all know that. Of course, the stigma, which comes from lack of education and understanding about how the source of mental health. But the specific social norms were like, quote, don't air your dirty laundry. It's kind of this idea that we are family, we are a collective. Don't tell a stranger about private matters. I saw that a lot as a barrier to seeking out care. The idea if you show anyone else that you're weak or somehow flawed, that they'll take advantage of that. And it was a really telling norm that I saw. Secondly, I saw just a lot of this idea that if I had mental health or problems, I was kind of predestined to do so. That maybe that's just the ancestors' way of saying that you're not a good person and you were somehow then cursed. And I saw a lot of that and heard a lot of that from families saying, well, our son, he's just not good. He's he didn't have the right kind of energy. So all those cultural values, I think, led ultimately to people not coming into treatment, or what we see by the time people enter treatment, it's very, very severe, or it's it's far gone. And I think that, if anything, breaking down that taboo and stigma. One of my mentors, Evelyn Lee, who started a tea house for gambling addiction in San Francisco, when she first did it as Gambling Addiction Clinic, very few people came in. But when you call it tea house, community gathering place, that's exactly what got people to come in and start having that discussions about what is going on inside the home.
So Tim, along with that, you mentioned gambling. Are there any specific social norms around gambling in Asian cultures that we need to be aware of when we're trying to help people who might be having problems with gambling?
About 10 years ago, we started to do academic research into the impact of gambling disorder in Asian American communities. And right away, I was met with just a lot of stereotypes. People would say, oh, Asians love to gamble, and it's in the blood. And these are really dangerous stereotypes. What we've broken down to, predominantly in the Asian American experience, being Chinese, Filipino, Korean, Vietnamese, really that number one, gambling is a behavior that for the most part is approved, it's promoted, it's celebrated in some Asian cultures, but that doesn't mean every single Asian household loves it. We also seen tremendous amounts of marketing by casino industry to Asian American communities, first, second, third, fourth generation. So combine these forces and somehow you can create almost like an artificial demand where it seems like all Asian communities are gambling at higher rates. What our research has shown through the years is that when you go into casinos in America, you see higher than expected rates of gambling participation among Asian Americans in the casino. And again, when you come into treatment, by the time Asian Americans present to treatment with gambling disorder, it's pretty severe. So I think it's a perfect example of a really culturally relevant behavior that for some promotes getting people together and it's part of the fabric of what a lot of Asian families and communities do. But on the other token, it creates problems for those who are most vulnerable. Think of a perfect example, the casino buses. These are a very, very classic example of a Asian cultural event where you have these buses that are picking up Asian population in Asian communities and taking them straight to casino. Full, even before a pandemic, older adults, younger adults, first generation, folks who are not acculturated. And when you ask casino operators, why do you have that? They say, well, because Asians love to gamble. Well, if you would put these buses in any other communities, you would get those people to go too when they're free and they offer free food. So I think that's an example of social norms around gambling combined with marketing forces from an industry that's all designed to kind of drive up business. So we can talk about that all day, but basically I think that's an example that I want people to think about.
Great, and we probably will. We've got a question from Tana Russell. Is mental health and self-care seen as more of an individual's needs or a family's needs? And Tam, I think you started to address this in terms of selfish views versus collective family views, community views.
Yes. So early on, when kind of going back to when you're saying how when you were doing therapy and you realized that everything that you learned, that you put on folks, it didn't work. That was one of the reasons why I went back to get my PhD, because after I got my master in social work and I was practicing with individuals with schizophrenia, I realized that everything I was taught, very good, but it wasn't effective with clients who were Vietnamese. And so I'm like, I must be missing something. So I went back, got my PhD, and realized that, well, there's still a lot that we don't know. And so going to what Tanya asked is that when I was in the PhD program at USC, one of my first role was as a program manager for a research project where I went out to interview individuals with schizophrenia. So my job was to go to these doctors' offices and wait in the living room and ask people to participate in our research study, to interview them. And what you quickly realize is how difficult it was, because it was the client, it was the family of the clients who took these clients to the doctor, and they were the gatekeepers to these clients. And so out of, probably 50 people that we met, I was able to talk to maybe 5 individually, and maybe 2 family agreed to talk to me. So as Tim mentioned earlier, it's a very family private, they don't air their dirty laundry. And mental health is still seen as, for a lot of community members, seen as either karma, something that was done in the past that you did, it was good, so this is punishment, right? For some community members, it impacts, if you have a mental illness, somebody who has a mental illness in the family, it impacts actually how other people view their siblings, views a family member. And so by the time that the clients do come, not just with addiction, with the gambling, but even in my area, mental health, by the time that the clients see, the doctor or get services, they are really at the most extreme where the family can no longer hide it and handle it. But mental health for the Vietnamese community, because that is really a lot of my work when I was a clinician, is really a family affair. And the family tried to absorb and take care of the impacted, those with mental illness, as much as possible. And so it is really hard to operate within our current very individualized system and with Asian folks, because they just kind of turn to their family members to make decision. So I would say as a whole for Asian community, it is more of a family issue and concern.
Great. So let's talk about another question, another area that impacts whole families, whole communities. Unfortunately, we can't talk about mental health issues today and not talk about racism and violence and the long-term negative effects these have on the mental health of persons of color. The levels of hate and violence today against Asian Americans may seem shocking to some people, but it's important to remember that these are not new in America's history. This isn't a new facet. This is part of this culture for its entire time since immigration to the United States. It's also important to acknowledge today and fight against it in our society. So what can we do to address these issues of violence and hate and work toward more inclusive future for all?
So I'll jump in and say, for me, I work at SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. We're an agency within the Department of Health and Human Services within the federal government. And so I think this issue of anti-Asian sentiment, hate, all of that, there's so much that can be done at the community level, but it also helps to have the federal government leadership denounce anti-Asian hate and violence and openly say that they will do something to work towards reducing these hate incidents that we've been seeing. And so the president did release a memorandum condemning and combating racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States. And so through that memorandum, there is a federal work group that is meeting to try to address these issues and identify best practices and federal policies as well that can address this issue. So I do think part of it is the policy piece and having a recognition from leadership that, you know, this is an important thing that we do want to address, and we need the help of communities that are working with Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders that, you know, identify as being part of those communities to give input. And also, as was mentioned earlier from Tim, I believe, to report these incidents, you know, like to speak up, to show with data, you know, what actually is going on, because as we know, this is not necessarily new, but maybe inflamed in the past year, essentially. And so I do think that's one area is, you know, actually trying to enact some policy to make some of the changes.
Yeah, I often wonder if COVID hadn't happened, would we be seeing this rise in AAPI violence? I mean, obviously, it's a huge rhetorical question we can't answer. I think the fact that they're videotaping it now, I think that's part of the story, because these things have been happening since the dawn of humankind. And I think about where our country is and what we need. We definitely need more AAPI representation in Congress and in state legislators and in local governorship. So that's slowly starting to happen. But again, you look at the numbers, it's not even close to what representatives have for the rest of the world. I think that's number one. Number two, surprisingly, I think popular culture has a huge impact on these areas. So I still see surveys from time to time, like name a few influential Asian Americans, right? And you see these surveys, and invariably it'll be things like Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee. And even now in 2021, that's what still gets named. So I think that's part of the story, is when we think about how Asians and Asian lives are being depicted in books and media and movies and in YouTube events, these are the things that have massive influence over the next generation. And I think that's really critical. I wrote, and this is a little bit of a funny story, but in college, I wrote an article about a wrestler named Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. And I wrote about how I was so proud that he had won this this wrestling title. And that was the first Asian to actually win a wrestling title. And then he lost the title like a couple of weeks later to this guy named the Honky Tonk Man. And I wrote it kind of as a joke, but I went back and I looked at it a few months ago. I said, that really was highlighting what the Asian American experience was, which was very few at that time, even now, become into these positions of celebration and heroes other than as kung fu and magical kind of leaders. And I thought that is why we need more representatives, more people like Vice President Harris, you know, who is part Asian, who's going to talk about the Asian American experience. And then once we have more, I think, leadership and more vocal, then I think some of that will trail off. But again, where would we be if we didn't have a year of COVID and just a whole year of schism in America? It's hard to say, but it's here now. And this is our opportunity to make something by speaking out, having sessions like this, having open discussions. And I just hope we don't lose this window a few months or even a few years from now.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Tam. And I love how, Victoria, you brought in like at the policy level. We need to really think about from this, policy level, but then how do we bring it down to the community level and recognize that, all the barriers before to services is amplified right now, right? So all of the mental health issues that came out of COVID, now for the Asian community, this is another added fear, another, it exacerbates their current mental health problems. And then all the barriers that were there before for them to access services now is even harder because they're even more fearful to go to services. And there's not that many Asian counselors. And so we have to fundamentally think about how we provide services during this time, because we can't, just say, oh, this is a safe space, because, for the Asian folks, it's not. And then I also think about the mental health impact on different generation, for young kids who think of themselves, I have 3 young boys and they were born here, so they're just American. And so for them to start to have to process what it means to be Asian American, this is the first time in their life that they have to confront this, and they don't even have the words, the concept to verbalize and to think about it, but they just know something is not right, and then for my mom, who, how they internalize it and, they try to spin it in a positive way so it's just, in a positive way, I mean, like, we'll just stay home, right? If we just avoid it. So anywhere I go now, like, I'm in my late 40s and my mom still yells at me for going out because she's fearful, right? So it plays out in these different things. And so for us as a community, recognizing that it has huge impact on our community through different generation, and it will be expressed differently. But, we just need more conversation like this to really be able to understand the community impact for during this time.
So let's talk a little bit about the conversation between providers, mental health, behavioral health, addictions, treatment providers, and their clients. Craig asks a great question about how to ask respectfully the right questions on finding out from clients how do they believe their own cultures have impacted their lives, their lived experience, and why they're coming and seeking help. So can you help address that for Craig?
I think that's a great start, Craig. Listen, I also like to ask, tell me about some of your important family traditions that happen in throughout the year. What are those meanings like that? Tell me about just how your culture, and particularly when I'm working with gamblers or addiction, how does your family, how do you view money? How do you view material things? How do you view breaking the law, as it were? But I think that's where, when we think about culture and mental health, at least for me, it's always about building that relationship I have with the client. And I remember in the very beginning, a lot of these Asian clients I work with didn't speak English, and we had to go through a translator. That created a very, very different dynamic in terms of connection, but you have to work with that. I think it's really important to acknowledge the role of what culture does to mental health and recovery. An example would be, it's like, well, I really want you to go to 12-step. I really want you to go to Gamblers Anonymous. But we may not understand. Like, tell me about how did your background or your upbringing, what would it be like for you, Craig, or anyone else, to talk about your issues in a room with a bunch of other strangers? So that's a great example of how you can learn about their culture and how it might impact your recommendation to send them to like a 12-step group or not. Same thing with medication. We get that all the time. I'll say, well, I do have medications that we oftentimes will use to help restore normal thinking, functioning, et cetera. How do you view medication? What have you heard about it? What is your own family experience and your own personal experience? What are your expectations around meds? That's a perfect example of how you bridge that gap. You don't just say, I'm going to give you Prozac, 20 milligrams, take one in the morning, call me in 2 weeks. It's going to have to be, what have you heard about Prozac? What have your parents said to you? What did your family, what does your culture say about using medications for mental health? So, and there really isn't a right or wrong approach, I think. I think more often than not, people just never bother to ask. I think that's the number one thing.
Yeah. I think that having that mindset of really recognizing that culture has a huge, impact on how they view the world and how they conceptualize, their problems. So asking about, like Tim said, about what, said more about their background, about their cultural traditions, but also be cognizant that sometimes when we specifically ask, like, how does your culture influence? Sometimes I don't think people can tease that apart, right? That's something I think, we are as professionals. We just, so we use those terminology. We can understand how culture influence our behaviors or the way we think. But if you're thinking from some of our clients, sometimes they're like, oh, does my culture impact, And so for the most part, it's just to get to know them more about their cultures, traditions. But if you're not getting the answer when they say, how does your culture influence? Just to recognize that sometimes people can't tease apart, just like a fish is swimming in water. They don't realize this, that's just their environment. That's just it. They just can't say, oh, this is water. And so it's our job to then start to make the connection.
So let's talk about our own biases that we bring to the table as well. Also not something new, although I think the terminology may be new to some people, the model minority myth. Victoria, maybe you can start us out here. This was a terminology that actually began in the 60s. And can you help share what it is and how does the model minority myth underplay mental health challenges?
Sure. So the model minority myth is essentially this idea that Asian Americans in particular, but sometimes it's the whole group, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, that they're high performing and basically do better than the other minority groups. That's sort of the very general term definition of it. And when you take that concept and you apply it to everything for a group that we already have discussed is very diverse, it becomes very problematic because in the context of mental health, the idea then is, okay, well, Asian American Pacific Islanders, they don't really have mental health issues or they don't have needs that need to be met, right? And some of the things that have been alluded to previously have also included the data piece. If we're not disaggregating data by race, ethnicity, then we're unable to see what those differences are that exist between the ethnic groups or, by the age groups, whatever the breakdown may be. And so with mental health in particular, as both the other panelists have shared already, oftentimes when Asian Americans do seek treatment, whether it be for substance use, addiction, or mental health, it's very severe at that point in time. Like by the time Asian Americans are ready to seek treatment, are able to seek treatment, or have access to get treatment, it's already escalated. And so the truth behind all of this is that Asian American Pacific Islanders do have mental health needs, and that we need to do a better job at trying to understand what those needs are by the different racial ethnic groups so that we can allocate funding and programs and everything to be able to get them to be able to get the treatment that they need. And so there is a statistic that is often thrown around related to mental health treatment, and it basically says that Asian American Pacific Islanders have the lowest level of mental health utilization rate for those that actually do have a mental illness. And so, that says something. This is saying for the people that do have a mental illness, they have the lowest level of seeking treatment. And so I do think the model minority myth is something we need to just completely get rid of. We need to, eventually stop talking about it and everything. Like, we need to break that down because the younger generations today, they're growing up in a different world. And, there can be a time when hopefully if Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders aren't portrayed in a certain way on media and through the news and this and that, we won't have these stereotypes tied to us that really disadvantage certain Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander groups, because there is great diversity, and some specific groups do have worse outcomes than others, and that's completely overlooked.
And I think the most dangerous thing about it over the last year, over 20 years, 30 years, is that it just influences funding. So when you don't have funding to study this, and NIH funding or SAMHSA funding or local funding, you just don't have the resources. So it self-perpetuates, is that when you don't have funded treatment programs that deliver culturally relevant services and no one comes, then it goes back to say, look, it's not a problem because no one's coming. Then we had this issue actually with our gambling program. We opened up Asian-specific treatment for gambling disorder, and very few people came. So therefore, I was like, oh, look, there's no problem. Therefore, you don't need these services because you're a, quote, model minority. So I think that's how it undercuts funding. I remember clearly once we were proposing a grant to study methamphetamine in Hawaiians, and the program officer's like, well, the rates of Hawaiians with methamphetamine use disorder is way lower than other ethnic groups. But I remember a colleague of mine said, but it's not zero. It's not zero. And it's still greater than zero. So shouldn't we treat the people? And it was met with skepticism. Say, well, yeah, but the numbers are lower than other ethnic groups, so therefore we shouldn't treat them. So it's a wedge, as I think the minority term is kind of a racial wedge that makes an easy explanation for why people won't give money or put more attention towards something because those decisions are hard.
Yeah. And I also want to add that sometimes we manifest problems differently. And currently we look at problems through the DSM-5 and how, if you hit these kind of symptoms, that means you have these problems. But in a lot of my work, and when I was in a doctoral program, we worked a lot on those who have depression, and recognizing that, Vietnamese express, and a lot of Asians express depression differently. So even if you use a scale like the Beck Depression Inventory that a lot of people use, and you look at, affects, do you feel sad? Do you feel blue? And they ask about your appetite and your physical changes and things like that. But so if you're using a measurement that is made for a certain type of population, you're really not capturing, the problems that is being manifested by this certain group. And so through my work, we found that, like other researchers found, that Asians tend to manifest depression somatically. Right? They'll come to you and they say, I have a headache and I have a backache and I have all these unexplained aches. And because, again, it ties to stigma, you can't say I'm sad. You can't say, I'm blue. What does I'm blue even mean, to different cultures? And so, but then because of that stigmatized or the lack of language, the barrier, they express it somatically. But because we don't capture it, as part of our measurement, then we say that this group of individuals do not have depression. So beyond the, the policies and the funding, it is also, we have to relook at our measurements and how we determine what is a mental health problem or not, to really fully understand the needs of the different communities.
So you've all touched on this, and Jerry has a great question. Victoria had mentioned that there seems to be the data shows fewer Asians seeking help. You've talked about community reasons for that. He's speaking specifically on gambling recovery. So let's start, Tim, with you. But do you understand barriers to accessing care based on community norms around we take care of ourselves in our family, in our communities, and then let's extrapolate that further into the full mental health area?
Yeah, and a lot of the themes are the same. Similar with gambling, the first thing we found is that many Asian gambling clients are like, I don't have a problem. It's not something that can be corrected. Their understanding of what's causing life problems from gambling isn't because of an addiction. It's because of bad luck, or I just don't have enough money, or I just don't have enough time to get to the casino. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, again, there's still so much shame in Asian households, particularly around money. So the stories, again, like I was told growing up, you came to America, you work really hard, you put your head down, you you don't cause trouble, and you save for the next generation. You don't spend on yourself. You save for the next generation. I'm the next generation, so I spend on whatever. But my parents' generation, they wouldn't spend a dime on themselves. So, but it always goes back to, as soon as you lose money, that is one of the greatest things. If my mom, I don't know, hopefully she's not watching, but if she, missed out on a sale, she was really upset. So it meant that the power of money was tied into your own personal feelings of how you viewed yourself. So therefore, when you lost a lot of money in the home via gambling, the shame was so powerful that the natural response is you cannot tell anyone, you cannot go anywhere, that you are the one that is completely responsible for losing it, and you are the only person to blame. And even more so, you don't even deserve to get better. You don't even deserve to improve your quality of life. So that holds back so many folks. And then the last thing I think people get held back, they're like, well, they don't know what treatment really is. A lot of the Asians in the first visit, they'll say, what can you possibly do for me? I've lost $200,000. I'm miserable. There's nothing you can do that's going to make my life better. So that, I think, is what I call mental health literacy, where a lot of Asian clients need to understand that the healing process comes from the relationship with your therapist. I tend to think a lot of Asian households have this sense of, okay, how do I make things better? How do I just want things to work, right? But mental health isn't a simple matter of taking a pill and magically all these problems go away. So a lot of various themes tucked in there between shame and stigma, mental health illiteracy. I don't even know if that's a term, but I think it's a good term. But those are some of the things that I've been seeing.
Thank you. Tam or Victoria, did you want to add anything there?
I also see this kind of tied to the Asian, model minority myth, and kind of when tying everything to your own merit, kind of what Tim was saying. So when everything is tied to your merit and you don't think about systems of access and opportunities and all these other forces that plays a role in impacting your life, and you think it's purely kind of pull yourself by your own bootstrap, merit kind of mentality, that everything that you did is you. And so it's good in the sense where it does, when we talk about hard work, that is a good concept. But on the flip side, when you lose the money, then when Tim was saying you don't deserve because it was all on you, then on the flip side, then it makes it harder to also receive services because it is so tied to your identity of how good you are. And, so sometimes our strength is also, it makes it harder for us to seek services.
Great. So let's talk about those services. Victoria, I'm going to direct this one to you to start, but everybody can certainly answer. When we say mental health equity, what does that mean, and how do we work to achieve that in our country if we don't have it now? And I'm just going to say right now, we don't have it now. So where do we go? What is it, and where do we go?
So I think for me, mental health equity is really enabling each individual to be able to reach their optimal mental health. So that's providing whatever supports that each individual would need to reach that mental health. And so, for today, we're talking specifically about Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders and those unique cultural beliefs and values that they may have. We need to be able to understand that one and translate that into the services that we are going to offer. So we've brought up so many different themes. So one thing was the representation of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders. That cuts across everywhere in our society, essentially, but specifically in behavioral health, that also goes into the workforce piece, which was a little bit touched on. We have a workforce issue where we do not have enough workforce to meet the needs of the U.S., basically the behavioral health needs of the U.S., but specifically when you look at diversity, we have a lot of work to do. And so being able to have professionals that look like you, speak your own language, identify with your culture, that's a huge thing. And we need to be able to develop programs, mentorships, fellowships, opportunities for the younger generation to know what the different behavioral health professions are, and to get them interested in it and provide incentives for them to really join in to this workforce. So that's one piece of it. And the other piece of it, in terms of equity, is really being able to provide those services that are culturally and linguistically appropriate, which is a big lift, but an important lift. If you belong to a country and you feel unrepresented, and everywhere you go, you feel like, wow, nobody gets me, or nobody understands, where I come from or what's important to me, you're probably not going to want to go seek services. So I think there's just a need for everyone to be a little bit more open-minded and vulnerable with how that patient-provider relationship exists, and being willing to listen to the client and to try to pick up on those pieces that they're sharing through whatever it is that they're saying that, links to their culture or to their language. There may be, you may have to listen a little extra to be able to identify some of those pieces, essentially.
Go ahead. It's basically, it's the right services at the right place at the right time. And that's how I think about equity. And I think about, this is where the power of telehealth can blow it out of the water, where now that we have telehealth, that means someone who speaks Vietnamese, who's in New Jersey, is a therapist, could actually now provide services to that person in California. So that is huge. I think that's an area where we're going to see a big explosion. I think number two, I think we have to see a lot more in kind of self-directed mental health care. And I know people are like, well, what does that mean? So stuff like people actually doing it for themselves, but quality care that they can access online. Maybe it's a online webinar, maybe it's online self-help workbooks, maybe it's some sort of artificial intelligence that works with them. But if you can't access the internet, that's no good. So it still has to be, I think the biggest part that's missing here is that link between community, mental health, and clients, and just having those partnerships that work together. And again, one of the lessons we've learned building our gambling program is that even if you have therapists that are well skilled to treat, if you can't get anyone inside the office, that's not equitable at all. And vice versa, if you have a group of people in the community who are desperate for care, who want to do something, and you have nowhere for them to go, that's not equity there at all. And I think those are the basics of health equity. Workforce is a really interesting one, right? Because even for me as a Asian psychiatrist, there's very few of us out there. There's about 900,000 physicians in America. There's about, I think, 60, 70,000 psychiatrists, and the percentage of psychiatrists who are actually identified as Asian American is less than like 6%. So it's a much smaller number. And that's also true, I think, in behavioral health there as well. So there's lots of really interesting areas to head into. And I think if anything is a positive message compared to when I went into psychiatry 20 years ago, going into mental health is so much cooler among this generation of young people. And I think that's really, really important.
Tim, what about coordinated care? We tend to do things still an awful lot in silos, particularly when it comes to addictions and mental health. What about if I'm more likely to go see my physician? How important is it to coordinate mental health and physical health and all of this together so that we're treating the whole person where they are most comfortable to get services?
I mean, that's definitely the idea. That's definitely the hope and dream. You go into a primary care clinic and person backache, headache, and then there's a embedded mental health person right then and there. It's slowly happening, but it's going very, very slow. And it's not like this implementation is going to be super quick. I think it goes back to having, again, a lot of model programs that are very, very successful, that showcase themselves to the world and say, this is how we did it. We've been so much more successful. We've been so much more interested, and that's terrific. I read a piece last week in the LA Times talking about how our whole culture in medical and mental health may be off, where we unfortunately prioritize profit and we prioritize, bottom lines, and that's gotten us away from the themes of community, connection, and just doing the right thing regardless of policies. And I think that, if anything, would be so critical for us to have those things in place rather than worrying about who's going to pay for this counselor, who's going to pay for this therapist, how are we going to get reimbursed for this session. I mean, even now, a lot of patients I work with, we'll have 5-minute chats, a few chats on text. Is that treatment? Should I bill for that? That's part of the integrated experience. But I'd love to see eventually brick and mortar, one-stop places where you can get all these things like Jiffy Lube, all these things done at once. You get your brakes, you get your oil, you get your windshield wipers, you get here would be your behavioral health, your mental health, your medical health, all that together.
Great. So let's talk from the practitioner's standpoint as a counselor. If I'm truly dedicated and I really want to find out more to help diverse clients, more about cultures, more about lived experiences, it's not up to the client to be their Google. It's not up to them to teach the practitioner. So what can practitioners do to become better informed, to be able to understand their own behaviors and biases so that they're providing more culturally sensitive treatment?
So this is a great question. And, I teach social work students and they always ask me for an ABC, what they should do. And, when have they made it? When are they competent? And so this is a great question in the sense where I feel as practitioners and even researchers, right, we all should always approach this work as being very humble and recognizing that we're in the process of learning and continually learning, and that there's so much more. So I think understand, the fact that you all are here today, those who are attending today, you're doing that first step of recognizing that you want and that you need to learn more. And so I encourage folks to continue to, be intentional about their learning. But once you kind of learn about the general needs of a community, recognize that, like I said, there's in-group differences, and always be humble in when people say, I'm Vietnamese, but that's not my experience. And even though you read like 5 books, went to 10 seminars, and they're like, this is how Vietnamese are, right? And then they're like, nope, that's not my experience. And then I think that the humility comes in as like, my bad. That's why I go, my bad, tell me, how is it for you? So I think that having that mindset really helps us to always be from the client's perspective and recognize that we should also push the boundaries in being allies and doing what Tim is saying is like, how do we fundamentally change our systems, right? Where there should be, and I think one of the questions was saying, about licensure, right? How should there be like national licensures that regardless of where my client is at, I don't have to get a license in every state, So there are national infrastructure, things that we have to do. But there's also fundamentally changing the way that, I'm in the business of training social workers, but I also recognize that we also have to push beyond the boundary of our profession and being comfortable of not teaching from a very, this traditional approach of therapy, and start to recognize on, touching, I think what Tim, you're saying is like more on community based, how it's really about connection to community, and have a broader perspective of what it means to work with our clients. And then our own behavior and biases, I think all good clinicians and practitioners make sure that we build in that reflection to always check in with ourselves and our client. And how do we build that in? Like, how is this work going for you? Am I meeting your needs? Let me know what's going on. I think that kind of reflection and feedback is really important to keep on top of where we might inadvertently, even though with the best intention, where we might inadvertently, through our power and privilege that we don't recognize, through our, biases and assumption that we are not helpful to clients. And I would say only the client can tell you how you're doing. So always make sure to check in with them and be very humble to receive their feedback.
Wonderful. And thank you. Victoria gave us a link to a DOH Health and Human Services cultural competency course that is free. So that's there in the chat for you. And also, Deborah Neal had a great follow-up question, Tim, on your telehealth question. She wants to get some clarification around, is she understanding that a licensed professional in New Jersey can work with a client in California or another state? So there's greater access to resources, but are there also barriers? Are there red tape between states when it comes to telehealth services?
Oh, absolutely, and that's in theory, and we talked about that. The idea of a national licensure would be ideal. We don't have that. As an example, my medical license in California, I am allowed to treat my patients who I started working with in California, who then moved during the pandemic to other states. I can still provide telehealth services that are paid for by insurance. I can still write prescriptions in other states. That's not true for all other, licenses like PhD or PsyD. Every state has their own rules. And I think that's where we need more clarity, because if you're doing and want to do these things, we really should ideally have that ability to expand. I'm working with an online telehealth company now, trying to do just that very thing, meaning that wherever they're based at, that they would be able to see clients from any state, anywhere, and provide services. But it still always goes back to the state you're licensed in. You have to double check with their current recommendations and guidance as related to telehealth. Again, a year ago when this all happened, they just rolled everything out and said, you know what, provide care, do what you can. They even allowed things like FaceTime, right? Which isn't the most secure. Now, I think now that we've seen the pandemic recede, but telehealth will not, I think we're going to start seeing in the next couple of years some rules and laws put into place. And I hope we can get more of these nationalized ideas for particularly culturally relevant services. Because again, when you have a native speaker who's highly skilled practicing, but they just don't live in that state, who cares where they live if they can connect via the internet like this? I think that's spectacular. I've, since the start of the pandemic, have had a number of patients who I've obviously never met in person, who aren't even from California, but I've been able to provide really good care for them that they said they would not have been able to access prior to the pandemic. So that, to me, is what equity is all about.
And I will point out that in June, the Evergreen Council is having a virtual course on telehealth post-pandemic. Where are we going? What are the HIPAA constraints? What's changing? What's staying the same? So I would invite anybody to check that out. I wanted to get more into something that you all touched on briefly, but I'm not sure we have time to really talk about the difficulties with accurate research data, whether it's data collection, disaggregation, or reporting, and the implications on public policy and funding. If anyone wants to address that a little bit, or if you have some last comments that you really want to leave people with today, I'd love to open that up to all of you and let you share your final thoughts.
Sure, I'll start if everyone doesn't mind. So I would say for data specifically, we need to be represented, essentially. We need to do better to have Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders represented. If we continue to see data reports where it does not show Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, then we will continue the cycle of just not being seen, not getting funding for us, and things won't change, essentially. So there is definitely a need for data and data disaggregation so that we're able to see what those differences are within the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community. The other piece that I did want to emphasize is this need for communities to be appreciated and understood as experts, in their culture and in their life. And so I think as we move forward to really try to tackle equity and reach equity, we need to also elevate the communities and the community-based organizations and the community centers, all those entities that have been serving the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, for years, for decades, for however long, but have a difficult time getting the funding to be able to continue to support their services or to really, move it to the next level, whatever it is that they want to do. But they are taking care of their population. They do understand their population. So we need to lift up those partnerships and also make those community-based organizations really visible.
Yeah, this is where I see is a total system at the top level that needs to be both incentivizing, providing funding to make sure that different groups are being researched, but also accountability, right? And making sure that we disaggregate data in everything that we do, and not only based on advocacy. And that's where, through the school system, the mental health system, every system, people just do the least possible in data collection as they can, and only do what they're held accountable to from a system level. And so I think it's a combination of how do we make sure there's resources so that researchers will really dive deep into these different communities to understand better of their needs, the nuances of their needs, but also holding all the systems accountable and breaking down as much as possible of who are they serving, and is it really reflecting the community that they're supposed to be serving?
Great. Tim, any last thoughts?
Well, those are really great. I was just thinking, ending on this idea that you think about all the research that's done for developing treatments for mental health or addiction, and how many, vast majority of those research participants are not from AAPI communities. And so that's definitely been a real concern for a lot of researchers, because these things then may not translate to the community. But I think it boils back down to, again, I'll just highlight I've been doing this for about 20 years, and the things we learn and things I've seen change dramatically in just one generation are really stunning, and compared to the way I think things were from like 1940, 1960, 60 to 80, 80 to 2000, now 2020, 21. We're talking about a whole movement of focusing on AAPI mental health and AAPI experiences. And I think that's really amazing. And I often tell our 15-year-old son, he's doing a whole project on the Boxer Rebellion in China. I didn't even know what that was until he actually started this project. And I think back to my own experience I did not learn about the internment camps here in California until I came to residency. Now, I thought that was really stunning. I went to a very good college, Northwestern University, but it just was never taught. And I thought that was so fascinating. I think, I'm highly educated, but I missed this huge chapter in our nation's history. So I think the huge part of all of these is getting, again, those stories, the stories of the culture, the stories of immigration, the stories of incredible success, the stories of tragedy. Those are the things that have to be put out there. And again, Tam, you were mentioning Rhea and the Last Dragon, and I was very excited to see that as well, but I just didn't want to pay for it. So I had to wait till it's free. But the idea is that we need more stories like that to really talk about how the different Asian cultures and how they impact mental health. So thank you so much, Maureen, for inviting us out. And we're happy to step up and do this again anytime you should need it.
Absolutely. We need more stories. We need more conversation. As I said in the beginning, this is the beginning of a long conversation. It does not end here today. Thank you for helping us launch the premiere. I hope that everyone listening today will continue this conversation in your agencies, your offices, your clinics, your classrooms, and in your living rooms. These are conversations we need to have at every level. So thank you all for honoring us. It was wonderful to learn from you today, and we will have you back again. Bye, everybody.
Bye.